In order for us to understand the present struggles over land tenure, we must first look at the historical revolution of land in Brazil. Brazil has one of the most advanced legal frameworks in Latin America, related to the recognition of land and property rights. Yet the situation on the ground differs significantly from the legal provisions. The arguments of land reform go back hundreds of years to the foundation of modern Brazil. When the Portuguese first settled there, they divided huge portions of land between a small number of aristocrats. In spite of the economic growth and social improvements experienced in Brazil in the early years of this century, the country still faces the challenge of resolving serious agrarian land tenure problems. Among these are the high levels of land concentration, the number of confrontations and violence, some of which lead to fatalities, and the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. The legal framework of the land occupations in Brazil dates back to the 1500s, when the Portuguese crown transferred possession of land to high-profile beneficiaries. In 1850, laws were passed in attempts to stop public land being taken over by private occupation. More recently, heavy agrarian reform has been pushed since the 1950s. Brazil had their biggest advancement in 1964, when they proclaimed the land statute. However, fearing the statute would favor peasants, landlords worked effectively to alter the language and objectives, and the statute was never fully applied. In the 1970s, the government created a policy on import substitutions, believing that Brazil would need to follow the stages of heavy industrialization that other developed countries had gone through. When import substitution failed, the IMF suggested the agro-export model to start controlling the resulting inflation and regularization of the credit system. In 1980s and 90s, the return to democracy meant that there was also a halt to the agrarian reform and the reduction of the state in rural areas. The state started to emphasize this model, which created massive migration of the people from rural areas to urban areas, and employment for most large-scale crops was done by poor and indigenous peoples. Environmental issues, poverty, and territorial inequality began to rise. The price of land began to heavily increase, also reduced the viability of any further agrarian reform. Reform was also stalled due to compensations. Even if the government could manage to expropriate land, still legitimate landowners would have the right to be compensated, which the government couldn't afford. It must be noted that there are two structures of land in Brazil: private lands and public lands, of which are administered by different institutions. One of the main agrarian problems in the country is land concentration or land monopoly. In 2006, the agricultural consensus conducted by the Brazilian Institute for Geography and Statistics showed that 50% of small farms occupied 2.3% of the total farm area. Conversely, 5% of the largest farms occupied more than 69.3% of the land. These concentrations of land simultaneously with a large number of people demanding land has put a large strain on the system. Indigenous lands are also complicated since they are considered from two different institutions. One institution manages territories from a social perspective, another manages from an environmental perspective. There's no recognition of the state or municipal mandate in the management of these lands, despite that they're being in their administrative areas. Due to Brazil not having unified registry of lands that contains both the public and private land and its occupancy, there could be overlapping that are a source of conflict among groups, not only indigenous peoples. In the insecure tenure system of Brazil, the insecurity of the tropical rainforest stands out because the amount of territory and the lack of presence of state accounts for ambiguity in tenure and the presence of illegal businesses that thrive from mineral and agricultural exploitation without controls. The disorganization of land tenure was so bad that in 1999, one of the land organizations asked landowners of over 10,000 hectares to provide documentation of ownership because they didn't have it. 46.9% didn't answer, and the information wasn't provided. The Amazon, where most indigenous lands are, was the least registries, which means that there could also be duplication. The lack or weaknesses of land records, the convoluted mechanisms to measure, regularize and register both public and private lands, the influence and control of landowners over political decision-making, the historic and fundamental socio-economic inequalities, and the unequal access to and control over land makes it technically and politically challenging to implement a rights-based responsible land governance framework in Brazil.